Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Imani Cheers, and for this event, I serve as the Director of Academic Adventures for Planet Forward. I am also an associate professor in this digital storytelling in the School of Media and Public Affairs here at George Washington University. And I'm also serving as our interim senior associate provost for undergraduate education. It is my absolute pleasure and honor to be with you all this afternoon and to help lead a conversation about environmental justice. We have a phenomenal panel coming up, and I'm just going to take a moment and briefly, very briefly, because we're going to learn a lot about all of these activists and educators and the work that they do throughout our presentation and our discussion this afternoon. So first, I want to bring up to the stage to join me, Lexi Hernandez. Lexi is she is an environmental justice research coordinator at Intersectional Environmentalist, and that is a climate justice community and resource hub centering Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and of course, historically underamplified voices in the environmental justice space. She conducts research on how different systems of oppression are interconnected with environmental issues and utilizes eco-communicating and storytelling to curate research-informed and accessible social media content. Lexi is currently a senior at Chapman University, and she acts in the role of curriculum consultant, partnering with environmental science and policy faculty to identify key areas to integrate environmental justice into the courses. So Lexi, join me, please. Very excited. Our next panelist that we have is Matt Scott. Matt is a manager for storytelling engagement at Project Drawdown. He's a graduate of George Washington University with a bachelor's in business administration, and he previously served as global community director and storyteller of the world's largest global hackathon, which is NASA's International Space Apps Challenge. His storytelling work really focuses on a vast array of issues: civil technology, ocean health, the circular economy, and sustainable food and nutrition. He's a creator and host of Let's Care, a social impact storytelling and engagement platform for underrepresented change makers, focused on passing the mic to those who often go unheard in social change. Through Let's Care, Matt has developed a video series titled 180 of Impact Features, a storytelling research project celebrating 180 people changing our world for the better. So let's welcome Matt. Matt, thank you so much for joining us. We also have, bringing up to the stage, our final panelist, who's also an educator like myself, so I'm very excited, for Dr. Lemir Teron. He teaches classes at SUNY-ESF in environmental justice, sustainable development, and environmental and energy auditing. He has an acute area of focus, including urbanization, energy justice, climate change, and legacy population, which I'm very interested to hear about. He holds a PhD in energy and environmental policy and a Master's of Science in Urban Policy Studies. He is active for a consultant for the New York Civil Liberties Union, one I-81 campaign, and he also has a host of other awards and accolades to his name. So we'll bring up Dr. Teron. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I don't even know what time it is. It's afternoon. How are you doing, sir?
Well, I'm well.
Excellent. So excited for everyone. So I'm going to go ahead and kick off our discussion. And this is actually a conversation or a question to all of our panelists. And I am very curious, as a storyteller myself, to what really drives your passion and the work that you do. So I'd love for you all to describe one or two inspirations, maybe pivotal moments in your life that led to you even being involved in environmental justice work. And I'll
Yeah,
let, or Matt, is that you?
I was going to say I could kick us off and dive in. So,
You.
for me, the interesting thing I think when it comes to climate change and climate justice in particular is that, growing up as a kid of the 90s, I, as a kid, was glued to the TV watching a little show called Captain Planet and the Planeteers, for anyone who's familiar. And I loved it. And I loved to see this idea that the power is ours, that a bunch of people had some kind of way of making an impact. And yet, I think beyond watching that series as a kid, as I grew older and became more aware of my own identity and the identities of those in the world around me, something I realized, especially in a real way in my career as a storyteller, was that when I'd show up in my work, I'm a social and environmental impact storyteller. I would work in these different spaces with organizations like NASA, like Nike, like Walmart, like the Obama White House, and others. And I would often be the only one of me in the room. And it was just a reflection of this reality that I faced, where I didn't feel like I belonged. I didn't feel like climate change and climate solutions and it were for me. And I didn't even know what climate justice was at the time, because that wasn't something I was seeing represented. And it really took took me being uncomfortable in spaces and saying, let me just put myself out there. I actually went to climate reality training in Los Angeles. So from where I am in DC all the way to LA to attend this training a few years ago with 2,000 plus people. Again, I had that feeling like, where are we? Where are the people of color? Where are the queer people in this room, in this conversation? And finally, I saw a panel that was focused on climate justice, featuring a number of people of color, but specifically featuring someone who was a young person like me, had asthma like me, person of color like me. And that's the thing that showed me, like, wow, I could actually do something, and I should use my real world superpowers, as I like to say, to do something. And so when the opportunity came up with Project Drawdown just over a year ago, I left my work with NASA and the Space Apps Challenge and the world's largest global hackathon, leading that, to focus on how we could bring more people into the room and widen this table of solutionists, as I like to call them, because like a lot of us traditionally are excluded and overlooked, and we're not being fully utilized in this climate space. And so that's a little bit of my story and how I ended up really focusing on passing the mic for climate solutions at Project Drawdown.
Matt, thank you so much. That was phenomenal. I know one of the things, and even when we were having conversations about kind of putting together this panel and being in this space, is like you said, wanting to see people that look like you, right? Yeah. I vividly remember Captain Planet, child of the 80s, not quite the 90s, but vividly remember the show. And what I really loved about even that representation is that all of the cartoon characters were of different nationalities, right? There was a very intentionality behind that cartoon to be inclusive and representational as they discuss these global issues. And that, for me, at least, that was one of the first times I know that I really saw people of color engaged in environmental work, even if we're still talking about a cartoon, but it was valuable, right? It was really important. Lexi, how about you? What brought you to this work?
Yeah, I always love sharing this just because I feel like it is quite a bit different than what most people think when they think about people who like work in the environmental space. But for me, I grew up in an area where like it wasn't very common for us to go do outdoorsy things. Like there wasn't a lot of, the only trees in my neighborhood were palm trees, right? Like we didn't go outside and do a whole bunch of things like that. I didn't watch any cartoons or things like Planet Forward. I had no real concept of like what environmentalism was outside of like reduce, reuse, recycle that you heard in class. And then I knew like this abstract idea of like environmentalists, oh, they're people who like love trees, they hug the trees, and like they don't eat any meat. And that's it. That's all an environmentalist was to me in my mind. And that's how it was for really a lot of my life. up until I was actually a junior in high school. And this was when No DAPL really started to take off in like the national news setting. And we had a conversation about it in one of my classes. And for the very first time, someone explained to me environmental justice and sort of the interconnection between the environmental movement and the way that it disproportionately, climate change and environmental issues disproportionately impact people of color. And that was my first time that I ever had really realized that people beyond just people who like love trees and don't eat meat also do environmental work. And there are so many other things that are considered environmental work. And also that these issues impact me, and these issues impact people who look like me and who care about more than just reduce, reuse, recycle. And it was just a very sort of, I think, different experience to sort of have like this moment where I felt like my whole world sort of like broke open, and I was like, this is what they're talking about. This is what they mean when they are talking about climate change, when they're talking about the impacts of it, when they're talking about how important this work is. And that's when I started to get really interested in environmental justice. And it actually wasn't until college that I think sort of more of my sort of climate story, if you will, sort of came together. But also growing up, initially the city that I lived in was all dairy farms. But also the city I lived in was predominantly people of color, and we were all of our parents were immigrants. And another reason why I didn't spend a lot of time outside was because outside was like a place that you would go sometimes, and then when you come inside, you smell like outside because there's so much ammonia in the air. So like everyone I knew growing up also had asthma, they also had eczema, we also had so many health issues, but we all just sort of thought it was normal. Like we would make jokes about it, and I just thought that was how it was everywhere. Then I came to college and I was like, oh, outside doesn't smell like a thing. Like it's not like a place that smells bad. It's like you can go there. Not everyone has asthma and eczema. Not everyone had these same experiences. And that's when I really realized that like so much of how I was raised was in like an environmental justice community, and we were experiencing a whole bunch of injustices, and it sort of took being removed from that setting to understand what was even happening. And that's when I think even more so was like, there's just so many different ways that environmental injustices seep into our communities and like our daily lives that we're not necessarily totally aware of. And that's when I was like, yeah, this is something that I have to do and have to keep ingrained working towards climate action.
Oh, that's so powerful. I mean, I know many of us can think of those very pivotal moments in our childhoods, but like you said, like the notion of like not wanting to go outside because of the fumes in the air, and then living amongst communities, farmers, like agriculturally inclined communities, and seeing that immediate climate and environmental impact is super powerful. So that is amazing. Thank you so much for sharing. Professor, sir, as a fellow educator, right? I always wonder as well, and our other panelists shared those like really pivotal moments for them. But as an educator, like what brought you to this space?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what brought me into the space, and then I'll tell you what sustains me in this space. So I've been invested in food security, food justice before I even knew that was a thing. I'm an old school community gardener. I love seeing something go from seed to my plate. And notwithstanding that beautiful introduction you gave me earlier, trust me, it was lies. I don't know who told you that, but half that stuff's not true. If it's one thing I'm proud of that I've done as a human, and this is no hyperbole, the very first solid food, my wife would put me in a headlock, very first solid food I ever gave my daughter was something that I grew. And that's something I'd want any parent to have if they want to have that experience. But we can't have that experience universally as long as our food systems, plural, they keep manifesting in the way that they do. So that's what really propels me. And let me tell you about just today. Let me use a sports metaphor. I don't know who all is on the call, but I'll use a sports metaphor. Hopefully it's not lost. I really feel like today is my 35 point, 12 rebound, 15 assist game. And what do I mean by that? This morning, I had a call with retired members of the AFL-CIO, labor, right? They wanted to talk about climate justice. Now I'm talking with environmental journalists about the same thing, energy equality, climate justice. After this, I have a call with some researchers. I'm doing a presentation on climate justice at UNC Greensboro. Once again, how do we talk about climate change within a just context? So the thing is, it's not enough just to talk about these things. We got to coalesce. You want to know what those seniors told me 2 hours ago? Where are your students, right? Are they ready to work? Not talk about these issues. Are they ready to do the work? So if people who are on average 65, 75, 80, if they realize the grave dangers of climate change and they're pushing young folks, and then I actually am talking to young folks right now, and then I'm going to talk to researchers, in about, what, hour and 25 minutes? Hopefully I still have a voice at that point. If that doesn't propel you, I don't know what does.
I love the sustainability aspect, right? And because, sir, this work is not any sort of activism has to be sustained. Like, I feel like a lot of times, especially as an educator and professor, I wonder if you also find this where, something happens, right? An injustice occurs, we're fired up, we're passionate, and acknowledgement that this is really a marathon, right? Like, we are, this is not, justice isn't a sprint. It's not, oh, okay. I mean, I think of Flint, Michigan, and the residents of Flint, Michigan, and they were, in the news recent because, the city, the state finally, right, after, we're now at like almost 6 years, 6 years of the known fact of their contamination of their water. Now there's some sort of like financial payout, but like this notion that like that still hasn't like addressed the issue, right? Like it's not a sprint to a solution, but it's truly it has to be a sustained and maintained marathon, because we're talking normally decades of injustices that occur that then even to be rectified, right? It takes more decades to even be addressed and acknowledged. So for all of us, right, as you mentioned, and I also love the antidote about the first foods that you gave your daughter was something that you grew yourself. That is amazing. I hope and wish, like you said, that every parent, caregiver has that opportunity. But I am curious for we see what inspires you. But like, what do you all think in particular, for all three of you, are some of the most pressing environmental justice issues that are facing historically marginalized communities, not only here in the US, but we're talking about the world, right? Like, what do we think are some of the most? And for each of you, maybe name your top three. How about that? And we'll start you with Professor, because we started with Lexi in the last.
Yeah, so I won't spend too long. Food insecurity, certainly, whether you're talking about domestically, abroad, food inequality is pervasive, and it's not going anywhere until we make it go somewhere. Energy inequality, same thing. As our winters get colder some years, those whose homes aren't weatherized, they are going to be in grave dangers, and they're going to have to make the horrible decision of, am I heating my home or am I paying for sustenance, right? I'm in the academy, so I'll end off on this. Who's at the table? Who's in front of the classrooms? Who's at the class, or who's in the classrooms? Meaning, are Black professors getting hired? Are Black students being funded to go into STEM? Same thing, Native students. We have to really do an overhaul. Who has entree to the classroom, both in the front of the classroom and who's ascertaining the material. The academy has a lot of issues, and until we really, I'm really pleased to hear about the good work Lexi is doing out on the West Coast, but until we truly interrogate who's asking the research questions, who's being researched, how is this being conducted, we won't solve these problems, at least within the confines of higher ed.
Yeah, that's so important. And not only who's getting hired, but who's getting tenured. I'm not tenured. GW won't give me tenure. We can talk about that later too.
Well, let me just add this. No matter what college I go to, and this is like a running pattern, I always have a slide. When I talk about environmental justice, I have in red letters. After that, I give you the formal definition, and then I say, let's apply it. What does a Black woman have to do to get tenure at this university? Because I've been at spots where you've never had that occur. So yeah, I'm with you 1,000%. Water,
I know. It's one of the issues, as you mentioned, who is in front of the classroom, right? Who are the people, not only from the classroom, but even all the way up through leadership. And it is incredibly frustrating to say the least. So Professor, that was fantastic. And food security is so important. And Chasha, that was wonderful. Let's go to Matt.
Yeah, so I would say just in general that one thing that I appreciate before getting to like the thing that I really think needs to be addressed, the thing that I appreciate about, my work at Project Drawdown, I mentioned why I joined, but the thing I appreciate is that we have these science-backed, data-backed climate solutions that kind of point to some of the areas that are the biggest contributors. So like reducing food waste is a huge thing that we need to do for communities, not just for underrepresented communities and communities that have been pushed to the margins, excluded, overlooked, but for a bunch of communities. Health and education is so critical around the world because that is a lever to actually give people more of the tools and opportunities to build their power and do something about climate change and global warming. And, the list could go on and on in terms of climate solutions. But the thing that I think is the biggest issue, and we've started to talk about it, is like back to what Lemir was saying, Dr. Lemir, I should say, is that we, who's at the table? Thank you, doctor. But yeah, Lemir, thank you so much for that. And I think like who's at the table is critical, and that's one of the biggest gaps. The reason that I'm doing the work that I'm doing is because we aren't at the table, and we need to do better at actually inviting more people to be heard, and not in the way that white supremacy culture says that they need to be heard. So, for instance, I think of like conflict and aversion to conflict being a huge part of that. The way that someone speaks, if someone raises their voice in a passionate way, in a way that might be perceived as aggressive, quote unquote, or not professional, that's not acceptable. So we need to be able to bring ourselves to these conversations without having to check these boxes of what white supremacy culture tells us that we need to be. And I think that that's one really critical piece. But beyond that, I would also say, and I'm sure that I'll repeat this again, is that words and intentions are one thing, but they don't matter as much as actions and impact, at least in my book. And there are so many people out there who say that they care, who say that diversity and equity and inclusion and justice and anti-racism and all these things are priorities. But what are you doing to actually support people like the people on this call to be sure that they're tenured and have these roles where we could actually have a major influence, especially to groups that, I went to GW, students like the students at GW who don't get these issues necessarily. I say that as one of the Black students sitting in crowds of white students. 6% of students at the university, were Black at the time that I was a student, right? And so we have to do these things. We have to make these changes. But I'm really tired of people who say that they care but aren't doing the work to actually propel our work forward, because the work that we're doing, not just as Black people, but as underrepresented communities, is actually what's helping us do something and ensure climate justice. But it takes work. So that was a lot, but I think this is a long conversation and there's a lot more to be said.
It absolutely is. And we're going to get to as much of it as we can, within the time that we have this afternoon. Lexi, what do you think? Like, I want to absolutely bring you into this conversation, especially being on the West Coast. What do you see as like the top three?
Yeah, I would just say, before I even get into those two, I think just to echo back to what's already been said, like it's still such an issue just about like who is even leading these conversations. And I think that sort of leads into just like wider issues within the environmental movement, which is even when I think especially here on the West Coast and in California, more cities are like trying to address climate action and like trying really hard to talk about environmental justice and diversity, equity, and inclusion. But at the end of the day, they're not working with communities, right? They're imposing solutions onto communities. And this is an issue that I've more recently become aware of working within near local politics, that people just want really quick Band-Aid solutions of, oh, look, we did this one thing, now environmental justice is solved, we're all good. And that's just not what it is. And also you can't just impose solutions based off of what research and data and science is telling you, because that's not what communities are actually like. Communities know what is going to help them, right? You just have to be there to listen. And I think sort of having that gap as well, like not having community members, you know, how what they know and their cultural knowledge also impacts even in spaces where we're working towards addressing them. But I'd say even beyond that, another issue is just the amount of pollution burden that we have, and especially for, you know, communities who have historically been oppressed, right? If we want to get into redlining, there's just so much issue. And I live also really close to LA County, and you can just drive through LA and like visibly see one block to the next, you know, the historical impacts of redlining. Like you still see it right now, you see it today, even in Orange County where I'm from. I go from one city to the next and you can see, you go into the next city, there's no trees, right? Like we don't even have palm trees in the next city over. Like at least here we have a green head. Historically, this was a predominantly white neighborhood, and that is the legacy that it leaves behind. And now I have access to green space because I live here, but that's access to green spaces, but just the pollution that you experience because of where you're living. It's just moving into a different neighborhood. Like there are so many barriers into moving, or once you do move, the pollution also sometimes follows you. And with research that I've been doing more recently, it was found that even, I think it was a study like a year or two ago, that even with communities of colors who aren't polluting, they're still taking on more of the pollution burden from neighboring communities. So it's like they're not even the ones contributing into it, yet they still are feeling all the impacts of it, right? Like they still have all the health impacts. And that's something also that obviously it's a very sort of big legacy that redlining has left behind, but something that really needs to be addressed because it has to do with all the infrastructure we depend on, right? Like we can't talk about pollution without talking. You are directly one and the same. We can't just say, oh, we're going to pollute less. Like, no, we need to make like legitimate work between those two are just really big issues that I think are at the forefront for communities who have historically been oppressed.
Yeah, that is, oof, Lexi, so much there. And I think one of the main things for me that really stuck out is the marrying, and you have to, right, of sort of policy, right, and especially the communities that they impact, right? When you think of, you know, people just, oh, well, how did these communities, you know, come about? And there were strategic, institutionalized efforts to not only displace people of color, but to intentionally place them in environmental wastelands, right? I think of whether, and it's communities across this country. I was looking in Washington, D.C., where I am right now, and even sort of the, you know, George, like these, you know, fairly now affluent communities that were historically Black people were displaced and moved. To other areas that are now have, as you know, the professor said, right, they're food deserts, right? They don't have food insecurity. They don't have, one of my students last semester, it might've been fall of 2021, but they did this for, we have our environmental projects they work on. And we were looking at tree coverage, and they looked at a map of DC and just the ways in which and where trees are planted. And it's no coincidence, it's no coincidence, right? That in communities that are predominantly Black and brown in DC, which is Ward 7 and 8, the lack of tree coverage versus in Ward 2 and 3, where GW is, and how in which those communities were all displaced through redlining. It was one of the most, one of the best projects that I've seen for my students, but in particular, like the connection of everything, right? And realizing that situations don't happen in these isolated silos, but everything is interconnected. I have another question for you all, kind of going on the same, like within the last, I'd probably say 5 years, we've witnessed the growth of sustainable and environmental educational programs, primarily at the university level. I'm curious, and Professor, I'm gonna have you lead with this one, but you know, how do you think these programs are going to shape the next generation of social justice activists?
Well, I'd argue that the next generation of activists should be shaping these programs. And let me tell you why. So I saw one of the check-ins earlier. Brilliant PhD student up at my university, M. Christie. Hopefully I'm not shouting you out too much, M. But M go to M's Twitter feed. I don't know what the handle, you can put it on the chat. But unlike any other human being I've ever seen, has really integrated a true intersectional, a true interdimensional way of understanding issues of equality, whether they be built around environmental issues, LGBT issues. And to read M's Twitter feed is to get an education. So although M took my class and got an A, I should be in M's Twitter feed class and get a grade. So beyond a Twitter feed, something that's simple, just that individual's movement making me global, linking me up with folks in Jamaica, activists. How can we coalesce around issues related to climate? So it's not just people speaking in isolation in upstate New York or the mid-Atlantic, because as whether you consider yourself to be an activist, a scholar, a revolutionary, or just somebody that does not want to see the planet disintegrate, if we're not thinking globally about this thing, then it's going to be a tragic failure. So unless we're linking with brothers and sisters overseas, whether it be in Central America, Africa, indigenous people in Australia, in the Caribbean, unless we're doing that, then it's a tragic failure. And usually it's the young people who are driving this, whether it be this generation, students in my class, former generations, people usually between ages of 18 and 30, they realize the necessity of looking beyond just close regional, city, nation, state borders.
Oh, that's right. I mean, the children will lead us, right? Like the youth, if any, I've seen throughout, my 41 years, and then of course, I'm a historian at heart, that every major like social movement has been led by youth. Right? Like in terms of who's going to be, I look at whether it be the anti-apartheid movements in South Africa, I look at the civil rights movement here in the US, and it is young people in particular who are really leading the charge. I'd love to bring in our two current and recent alum, Matt and Lexi. For you all, what did your educational experiences, how have they prepared you for the work that you are doing now? Or did they prepare you?
I could start out only because for me, it's a little bit different. Like I graduated from GW in 2014, and it was really, that wasn't that long ago, and yet it was a different world in a lot of ways too. And so the ways that we talk about climate in conversations about things that people, even at that time, didn't bring climate into is so much different. And so I would say that in so many ways, my education as someone who studied business administration and marketing did not it did not directly prepare me for a lot of what I do now. A lot of what's really prepared me and strengthened my skills for the work that I do now has actually been informally. So over the last 5 years, from January 1st, 2017, I started something called Let's Care, as you mentioned, Imani, in the intro. And I just have gone out and had conversations with change makers, with people whose voices aren't being represented. And I think to tie that back to this idea of what education on the university level looks like, something that troubles me, even not just with universities, but beyond, is that so often we only look to a certain type of person to get expertise from. Like we don't look to people's lived experience as being valid, or we don't truly spend time with that individual who might not be quote unquote important, might not have the degrees, might not have the title, which is huge, for their expertise. And I think that's a massive blind spot, because we're conditioning people that we educate about climate change, about global warming, about climate solutions even, to think that these are the people, let's say up here with these degrees, quote unquote, that you should listen to, as opposed to everyday people contributing to the conversation. So that's what I would say, is it hasn't been the textbooks or lectures or discussions curated by professors for me, as much as it's been talking with people, learning their experiences through Let's Care. I've interviewed 100 plus change makers long form, but then also just kind of gone out and shared those stories. So one of the things I did is releasing a film around that, and it's all kind of helped me see that, like, each and every person's story serves as data to inform our narrative. It's not quick and easy, like it's not a one-stop shop for the answers, but it does really build a more full view of what we need to do to actually create a more inclusive space for the people who are not currently being included.
That's so powerful. Thank you, Matt. Lexi, I know you recent grad, like how has your higher education impacted the work that you do?
Yeah, I would say just as far as even going back to your like earlier question of like, has your education prepared you to do this work that you're doing? And specifically with doing the work within environmental justice and like working to like gather data and stories and to talk and, you know, to talk about people who haven't usually had their voices heard within the environmental movement, I would say that my education has definitely prepared me. But in a lot of what doing environmental justice work is showing up spaces where like you're not expected to come, right? You're not expected to show up. You're not expected to have these hard, nuanced experiences and add layers and talk about racism, talk about capitalism when you're also talking about climate change, right? Those aren't expected conversations. You sort of have to like add them into the narrative of the environmental movement and within climate action. And that's what I've had to do throughout my education, right? So throughout all of my 4 years, I'm a senior right now. I also, I guess for clarity, go to a PWI. Never have we ever conversations around environmental justice up until this past year. And that's because students together formed a coalition and said, we are demanding class to talk about this, right? So all other times that we want to talk about environmental justice, it's been in clubs, it's been outside of class with your friends. It's never in an academic setting. And it's sort of created like a taboo or a stigma around environmental justice that those are sort of harder questions and conversations that shouldn't be happening in the classroom. In the classroom, we're talking about technical solutions, we're talking about policy, we're talking about things that have worked in the past. We're not talking about environmental justice, and we're definitely not talking about racism. And I think getting the experience of being forced to say, okay, but what about this? And being forced to say, oh, so are we going to say that that's environmental racism, or are we just going to keep talking? Has really prepared me to go out into the world and do this, because, you know, these aren't conversations that the world wants you to have. Like, you know, I think in general, things would be much easier if we don't have to have these hard conversations around racism, around justice, and around the way that environmental issues disproportionately impact, you know, very specific communities. But we do, and we real climate solutions, and we want to address climate justice. And I think this, you know, having to get the experience the hard way of learning that it's either I do it or students like me do it or no one will, has prepared me to go into sort of like the environmental space and be like, hi, I'm here again, and we're going to have these conversations, right? It's really in a way sort of toughened me up and made me see that I have up in these spaces, and I have to be loud, and I have, even if they're not conversations that are already sort of like on the itinerary or in the textbook of things we're going to be talking about. It's like, okay, well, we're adding them now. This is important. So I think that's one way that my education is working in the environmental space, like with all of my identities and all of my experiences. But yeah, I think also to go back really quickly about Dr. Lemir's point about just who is even in the classroom, and can we have people who don't have degrees, right, going and showing up and teaching classes? Well, we should, right? They're the people who are on the front lines. They're the people who have the experiences. They're people that are connected to these issues. They're not the people who are sitting in these in their offices and just thinking about things. Like, yes, we need people doing both, but we also need educators in both, right? Like, we're not all going to go sit in an office and write policy. A lot of us are going to be on the front lines. A lot of us are going to be in communities. A lot of us, we need to have sort of that bridge as well. So yeah, that's what I would say. I think a bit of my education has sort of both taught me and also made me realize that we need more of.
Oh, wow, that was fantastic. And I just wanted to really remind you know, our attendees, if you have questions, we do want to make sure that we get some of those to our panelists as well. We will have an official Q&A shortly, but if you have questions as they come, please share them with us. And Professor, we have a guest with us. Did I hear correctly that you are not by yourself right now?
So I have a under the weather youngster. Some of you all probably thought I was going spelunking or hiking, but I got a little man that's under the weather right now. So he's chill when he's on my back. When I was in an earlier presentation, he had a total meltdown. But once I got him on my back, he likes being up under daddy. So he's good.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, I definitely hope that he feels much, much better. And I mean, I love that. Like, I think a lot of what I'm hearing with all of us and all the research I've done is that the way in which for our panelists, all of us, so like our families impact us. So whether they be, Lexi, you talked about, as a kid and growing up in a community and of agriculturalists and farmers, and Professor, you mentioned as well, whether it be growing food for your family to consume. I think that's so important. So the work that each of you do in the space, is there, do you think about legacy in your work? I know, Professor, maybe because we have children, but like, are we like, most of the things that I do, like my son is at the forefront of my mind, right? Like he's 7 years old. The stories that I tell, he is one of the people that I am constantly thinking of. And part of what I found for most activists is like the altruistic view of the work that we do, right? We're not doing it just for us and ours, but it's really for the benefit and benefactors of others. So does that resonate with you all as well?
Go ahead, Lexi.
Yeah, I'll just go ahead real quick. So I don't have any kids, and I feel like because of that, also being so young, I didn't ever really tend to think about like, oh, like, doing this work for my children and their children's children and things like that, but very much more so towards like, we're experiencing these injustices right now. And like, it's great to think about the future, but like also what about everyone right now? And that was, I think, a really big sort of centering point of a lot of my work for a long time. Up until this past year, I actually read Octavia's Brood, and there's like one very specific story within Octavia's Brood. There's like a whole bunch of really short science nonfiction stories, but one of them is basically someone who's like writing a letter to their ancestor, and they're like just a whole bunch of generations later, and they in their letter they're like, I just want to thank you so much because it just felt like you and everyone you knew, like in your hearts, you knew that the work that you were doing would lead to us being able to live the lives we have right now, and like live in these very joyful, loving, like well-resourced communities. And like, I don't know how you knew that we would be here one day, but we are. And like, thank you so much. And I actually have here where you just like sit and pretend that you're like, your child's child, and like you're writing a letter back to yourself as an ancestor. And it's like, what is the work that you're doing? Like, what is the legacy that you're leaving behind? And what world do you want to imagine in the future for people who are going to come after you? And that was sort of my first time really thinking and that broad of a scale of that later on. And it was like so deeply touching. I just remember writing that letter and crying and thinking like, wow, there are going to be so many people after us. And like, even just the progress we've had in the past, like 20, 30 years within the environmental justice movement, like I just makes me like emotional thinking about like the very different world that all of our work is going to be able to bring about for people in the future as well.
Yeah, and something just to build on what Lexi was saying too is that a lot of the conversations that I feel that come up around not just climate justice and the work that we're doing, but more broadly social change, is looking at the next generation. How do we leave a better world for the next generation? But something that I've really hit home, like this year through Project Drawdown, I've been so thankful to have at least so far 40 opportunities, 40 different talks and workshops connecting with communities. And something that I like to hit home with those communities, because so often those audiences are white people who aren't, necessarily from underrepresented groups, especially as a person who is from multiple underrepresented groups, is that each and every day there are people who are living with these challenges. And, we could talk about climate and the people who are impacted most immediately, but something that I've kind of struggled with and found myself shaking the table talking with people is we can't wait to do this work. I can't think of my nephew Micah, who just turned 3 years old, and say I need to leave a better world for him, because the reality is, like, all of us actually are young enough where we will be experiencing the very horrible negative effects of climate change on our world and of global warming on our world if we don't do something now. And it is really sad to see people who say, okay, we'll get to that next year, or we can have this casual conversation. Oh, I don't want to do this work, someone else could do it. When the reality is we need to do this work now. And I always get a little afraid thinking about those conversations about the next generation, because I also see a lot of people who unfortunately use that as an excuse to pass the buck to the next person and say, this is your thing to do. We have time, when we don't really have time, which, the IPCC Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report from this past August points to that, calling it global warming and climate change code red for humanity. We need people to realize how urgent this is, but even more, realize how urgent this is for certain communities who are not already in the conversation, who are overlooked way more than than we need to be.
We definitely do not have time to postpone anything. I feel like for those who were paying attention to the summit in Glasgow this week, that was a blaring effect. Right? There is if we keep this up, there will not be a tomorrow. This whole we'll put it off. It's like it's just not gonna be there. Professor, I'd love to get your thoughts.
I don't think too much about legacy, but just as you two are talking about, a recent student's perspective, in the field perspective, I'm really thinking about it within the context of your initial comments, Dr. Cheers, on this is a marathon. So if there is one legacy for the four of us collectively to try to create, how do we make it so it's not a marathon? What do I mean about that? Or what do I mean by that? So I'm thinking about colleague Hernandez's work in getting an environmental justice class at her university. Like, that's something that no student should. Like, how do you want to do your schoolwork if you're demanding basic accountability, right? So I never want my kids or anybody to be too adjusted. This is a marathon. What do I mean by that? Not everybody's going to be an activist, nor should they be. Not everybody's going to be a militant, nor should they be. Some people should just be, hey, I want to make video games. I don't want to have to be a activist, speaking for basic dignity, humanity, and accountability of power structures. So if there is any legacy to leave, certainly I can't make it by myself. Let's never be too well adjusted to these slow timelines. If my kid wants to be a doctor or an EMT without thinking about inequality, then ultimately we have to eradicate inequality. Now, the question is, are we willing to do what it takes? If you think climate change is the grave danger that we all know it to be, conventional means of addressing these issues, those are no longer on the table.
Oh, that's good. And it is. I think we've realized, right, as we are the pressing nature. So that is fantastic. Thanks, everyone. We do have a couple of questions in the Q&A. So I'd love to shout out the founder of Planet Forward, Frank Sesno. His question is, we'd be interested in your thoughts on this one. We study and talk a lot about how we frame stories. How should stories about environmental justice be framed? And how should diverse audiences be represented in ways that embrace the complexity and diversity within these communities?
Yeah, I could start us out as a storyteller in my work. That, the first thing that comes to mind is that, and it's always so interesting because I think of my work as a storyteller in two ways. One is that it's really given me this power to learn the experiences of a lot of different people who are not already represented in the conversation, but also personally, it's so meaningful as someone who's the type of person who would be featured in some of these more quote unquote diverse stories. The key thing I want to say is that we need to be so mindful of who is telling the story and who the storytellers are, because so often when it comes to, I'll say broadly underrepresented groups, but I think of Black people, people of color in particular, is that we, the ways that the mainstream media talks about our stories paints us more as victims, as people who need to be helped, as people who are on the receiving end of the negative impacts, and not as people who have the power to contribute to solutions or to tell our own stories. And, you know, as an interviewer, and I'm especially sensitive to this now, the more and more that I do interviews, is that we like to tell a story with this one. In 2019, I went to San Francisco and interviewed 21 changemakers over 6 days for a film I made called 20s and Change San Francisco. And it was all about not just social impact, but about identity. And the questions that I could ask the people I was interviewing were so much different than someone who is a white cisgender male could ask. And so we just need to be really thoughtful that we need to pass the mic, but also pass like the camera, pass the production crew, pass whatever to people who are from these communities, rather than trying to come in and say, how should these stories be represented for these people? These people, these underrepresented groups should be the ones who are telling the stories without that filter of someone who's not from that group, in my opinion. So that doesn't fully answer the question of how we should frame the stories, but I think that kind of speaks to the fact that the stories need to not be filtered. They need to be off people's authentic truths. They don't need to be just one slice of how they view the world, but really their truth needs to be represented. And you're not able to pull out that truth if you're not able to connect with someone authentically, if they don't feel comfortable sharing their story with you, or if you just don't understand the depths and layers that are part of their stories, which again, a lot of the people who are in these roles as journalists, as storytellers who are not from underrepresented groups, just don't have the ability to do. So I personally see like my identities as a superpower when it comes to telling some of these stories and framing more of these environmental justice stories.
Thank you, Matt. That was fantastic. I feel like that story is perfect for you. Yeah, like Lexi and Professor, any thoughts around the idea of how we frame this content as we're trying to obviously, you know, be more represented and especially mainstream media?
Yeah, I would just really echo everything that Matt just said. It's definitely about like who's the person asking the question, right? Who's the person holding the camera? Who's the person editing everything together and like creating these stories for people who maybe aren't of that community group to consume. But I think even within that, it can sometimes be difficult and be a slippery slope to fall into like just oversimplifying a community group to a couple different views. And people are like, oh, well, that's taken care of. Now we have that perspective. So, and it happens all the time, especially just personally speaking, like within the Hispanic community, they're like, oh yeah, we had like one Mexican person talk about their experience with environmental justice. So actually, we have like the whole Hispanic community covered now. Actually, no, there's a lot of different community groups, even within just saying like Hispanic or Latinx communities. And like one perspective does not cover that, even if we're just going to talk about like, for me, like my Mexican American identity, my experience is in no way like a full reflection of what it is for most Mexican Americans, right? Like we all have very different identities, and my story alone will never capture the nuance that is just this one group of Mexican American identities, you know, and like that's not even talking about subcategories of like people who actually immigrated here or people who are second generation, third generation. Another issue within how we frame stories and something we have to be really aware of is, are we just sort of having a story and having it be told by a person or telling the story of a person just to check a box on like, as far as diversity goes, like, oh yeah, we have that one story covered for the month now we're good, let's cover some other issues. We have to be really intentional that we are, you know, sort of working towards that nuance, getting a whole bunch of perspectives. And if we don't have a bunch of perspectives, saying that this is very specifically the perspective and experience of one person. This is just one story, a drop in the bucket of what, you know, injustices these community groups are feeling. So I think also being very aware of that. And that does come with having the experience and knowing, right? Like, you know, a group is not a monolith. And that only comes from like talking to people. And then that sort of breaks down even our own personal biases around like, oh, you guys haven't all experienced this. That's great to know. So yeah, definitely comes with experience working with different community groups and different people with different intersecting identities. But yeah, just being aware of that when we talk about environmental justice stories, that we're not capturing sort of the experience of everyone.
That's powerful, Lexi. Yeah, because a lot of, again, the non-monolith, like I really need people to fully understand that the intersectionalities in all of our lived experiences, right? Just bring out, there's differences within these communities. Professor, some of your thoughts around framing.
Yeah, do you really think I can add anything coherent to what Lexi and Matt just said? No, don't ever ask me to answer a question after those two go first. You set me up and I thought you was my sister.
I got you.
Yeah, you set me up. It's all good, though. I got love. Now, on the real, though, narratives matter. So I never want to get caught up into the politics of representation. Okay, we got the, as Lexi said, we got the transit check. You know, that's demeaning. And at some point that becomes like pornographic, right? Exploitive. Like let's go into a community and really bleed them of their pain. So at some point we have to say that we have to control narratives and we have to control media. If you are part of a disempowered group, a disenfranchised group, there's nobody ever going to be able to tell your story the way that you can tell your story. There's never going to be anybody that can coalesce around your community in the same way that you can coalesce. So you can never do that unless you're running the show. And that's why Matt's comment on not just somebody holding the microphone. Who is that editor, as Lexi said? Who is the person who has the camcorder, as Matt said? Who's the editor back in the newsroom, right? Who is the head person? So until we start to, and once again, you got to be careful because people hear these snippets and say, well, you know, we hired that Black associate female professor, check. We've checked off the box, so we're in the clear. And what you'll never understand when you play those type of games, that person is not just going to be the photojournalist or not going to be the full professor. They're going to be a psychologist, a psychiatrist, a nurse, because everybody's going to kind of run to them to problem solve, right? So maybe that was a little bit of coherency at the end, but don't do that to me again, Professor. I'm only answering questions first.
That is fair, because I mean you killed it. You knocked it out of the park, because it's the all of those amazing technologies. I mean, I have found, especially being one of the only Black faculty members in our department. We now have 3. I came in, myself and a colleague, so there were 2 Black women, and then, you know, fortunately we were able to bring someone else, but it's been slow. I've been here like 8 years, and you're right, you're not just one thing. It's a constant of, you know, of, hey, we only have one, so we're going to run to said one, right? It's very interesting. We have another question in the chat. In education, I teach environmental communication and perception related classes. And as someone who is also passionate about food related issues, more specifically, what do you think are some of the most important issues and existing cases to talk about in class? And Professor, I'm gonna start with you.
Thank you. So I teach with the brilliant person who asked that question. So I don't think she has any incompetencies when it comes to networking and getting the important issues at the forefront. But one thing I'll say, know the local community in which you're talking about food or any of these issues. So for example, I live in a community, or our school is situated in a community that has a community-wide exemption for free lunch. So every day, kids who go to the local schools, every single student gets a free breakfast and a free lunch due to pervasive low-income households. That is an abomination, right? When low income, when economic inequality is so pervasive that every single student gets a free breakfast and free lunch because you have a rampancy of low-income households, that's a problem. That's an abomination. So a lot of times we think about food internationally, supply chains. We try to define local. Was it 150 miles? Is it 75 miles? We think about the chemical input, synthetic versus non-synthetic pesticides that we're using. A lot of the game is going to happen on the ground. And that game that I'm talking about is what are the real lived conditions of people that are operating in our own communities.
Yeah, it's definitely, I've found, and I want to also get Lexi and Matt's insight as, I feel like the work they do as, they're also educating. When I constantly tell my students, especially in my capstone class, my advanced senior capstone, most of our students, we live in, Northwest, fairly affluent part of Washington, D.C., and I require them to do their stories and projects outside of what's called the Foggy Bottom, right, which is a neighborhood, like get out of this area, go into other communities. But I would get feedback that, well, Dr. Shears, I don't feel comfortable going in these communities. I want to talk about food deserts and I want to go to, Ward 8 and Acostia, but I don't feel comfortable. And as storytellers and storytellers in training, I'm constantly encouraging them, of course, safely, but to push themselves out of their comfort zones. And I was like, do the research. Like, I don't want you speaking for communities. If you're not of that community, you want to highlight certain issues, whether it be a food desert, et cetera. But you need to have those voices. I do not want them to be the next generation or the current generation of storytellers and content creators that don't talk to, right, communities. They write about communities, but they don't engage. They don't take the time to learn. And these, of course, I teach at a PWI. We all know this, right? I might have two, Matt's like, yeah, I know, right? I might have two Black students in an entire academic year. Not even a semester, an entire academic year. Or Hispanic students or Asian students, right? That's just the case. But really wanting to push our students to learn as much and be not only allies, but also advocates, right? We need like advocates in this space. And I hope sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but that's where they're, pushing them again out of their comfort zone. So Matt, or Lexi, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll even just dive in just to kind of comment on some of the things that you mentioned, because like now I'm originally from North Jersey, maybe 15 minutes from Newark, but I've been in DC for 11 years now, and the first 4 years of that was my time at GW. And I want to first of all say how impactful and meaningful it is for me. I'm thankful that, while GW itself is a PWI, primarily white institution, that those professors that were most meaningful for me, it was like, I can't underscore the value of professors, the few administrators who were Black people and people of color, but specifically Black people who I could see myself in. And even if we weren't really represented in the room, it was just so powerful for me to see like, oh yeah, I belong. If the professor belongs, then I belong here too. And so I just wanted to underscore the importance of that. But the other thing I wanted to reflect on is that, in those 4 years as a student at GW, I lived on campus all 4 years, was part of like the Residence Hall Association, and really involved in too many clubs in campus, more than it's embarrassing how many I was involved with. Like DC is so small when you are a student at GW, for instance. Like I was like, oh, okay, but what? There's stuff that's beyond Northwest DC, beyond Foggy Bottom. Like the world really expanded for me after, which kind of points to how limited it is for, I think, a lot of students. So obviously that discomfort connecting with communities beyond that is concerning. And it's something that I think universities in general, not just the George Washington University, need to work on to address, to kind of widen that table. The one thing I want to say, though, to this question is I just think that it's so important for each person to find their way of engaging with climate justice and climate solutions. There's no one size fits all approach. Not everyone needs to address food insecurity and reducing food waste. And actually, a month ago, I was part of Frank Sesno's class on sustainability reporting. And one thing I appreciate about that is that the class pushes those students to find a project that's in DC, I'm sure even beyond the Foggy Bottom community, and to really explore that and engage with that and get to know that. So I would really say, no matter what people do, is that it's so important for students to find their way of plugging in and the thing that's really interesting and relevant for them, and to get uncomfortable, because it's no surprise that most students are uncomfortable with the people and places like Anacostia, or even just places that are not Foggy Bottom and the demographics represented there. Thank you for the laughs, Lemir.
But it's so true. I'm so happy that you mentioned that, because it's just points on points on points. Lexi, I want to get you in here. We have another question, and then I also have a sort of final wrap-up question too. We have two questions.
Just really quickly, I would just add on also just such, I feel like, great holistic views to really go towards like the root of this question. But I would just also add that when it comes to like, you know, going into the communities, you know, talking to actual people, making sure that your work, whether it is on, you know, talking about food, whether it's talking about pollution, no matter what the issue is, you know, actually having those interactions with community groups, finding your own lane. I will say something that I've been thinking more about is that all of us at some point are, you know, not in the in-group of the community we're trying to work with, right? So like, even as a person of color, I do not know the experiences of other people of color. Like, I can still go into a community group and that is not my community, right? So at some point we all have to learn how to be allies and how to be advocates and how to be uncomfortable. Even if you're like, oh no, I have all the different identities. Like, I can't even list how many things I have going on. Like, no, you're still gonna find yourself in a community one day where that is not your group. You're gonna have to learn how to be uncomfortable and how to be an advocate and how to be an ally, even though it is a hard process, but the only way you're gonna learn it is by doing it, is by putting yourself out there, and is by working with and for community groups, rather than just saying also, oh, I'm a person of color, I can speak for them, I'm pretty sure I know what's happening. You know, so I think also being aware of your positionality also is really helpful, no matter your identities.
That's excellent. That's excellent. We have two more questions that just came in. One from my colleague, Lisa Palmer. What are top 3 to 5 stories, narratives of environmental justice and climate justice in the media that people are getting wrong, and some examples of media and people who are getting that question or getting those issues right? I don't know if anyone, and I'll go ahead and jump in just to kind of start us off. I recently started, not recently, in all fairness, probably this summer, so a couple months ago, started watching the Black News channel. And I guess depending on, of course, your cable provider, whether or not you even have that channel, but in particular, there's an evening program that Mark Lamont Hill, out of Temple University, he's a distinguished professor there, but he's also a journalist and an author, and so he has a nightly news program on Mondays through Friday from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern, and I found that is one of the only programs, and I watch a lot of news. I'm a news junkie. I watch a lot, that will have the nuanced conversations around environmental justice and climate justice. And maybe it's obviously because, you know, he can sort of stretch his conversations out. He's leading them, so he can dive in and have a 15, minute conversation where on your, ABC, CBS, whatever, you're only going to get a 3-minute segment, right? So he can go in depth for 15 minutes and have that dialogue. And I feel like he's really, and the Black News channel in particular, but his show specifically, is really unafraid of not only like tackling really important environmental justice issues impacting Black, Brown, Indigenous communities, but he's also just not afraid to, like, whether it be bring on activists and individuals who are really going to speak honestly. Like, I feel like a lot of time the mainstream media, that whether it be broadcast or a cable, that they're not, they're this like sense to hold back. You don't want to call it systemic racism. You don't want to just really name things for what they are. And it's easy to, again, in a 2.5-minute segment that's sort of, put together in a nice little bow, you can't get in depth anyway, they gloss over the topics and the issues. So I know one story in particular that they recently did. So again, whether it be conversations around Flint, Michigan water crisis, but as well as looking at within Indigenous communities, these pipelines being built and having like real conversation. We know like the Dakota Access Pipeline from a couple years ago, but other Indigenous communities who are being torn apart as a result of of these pipelines kind of dragging through their ancestral land. And Lisa said 3 to 5, but I know I'll just leave it at 2 because I want to open it up to the panel. Were like 2 that I've seen recently on the Black News channel. Shout out, I don't work for them, but I encourage you, if you have an opportunity, check them out because they're doing some really great stuff. And my colleagues, I'll open it up to anyone who would like to jump in.
Throw in most media, especially large media, through the sin of omission gets a lot of issues. Like, when's the last time you heard a big news organization use the phrase environmental racism? Hell, they won't say environmental justice, so you know they're not going to use the word racism. And then when we start talking about issues of race, who gets centered, right? So through sins of omission, you know, climate change, look at how climate change gets depicted, excuse me. Look at the time and the standing that climate denialists get, right? Same thing with COVID. We hear a lot of lunacy. Look at the amount of time within an hour or in a day that COVID lunacy is allowed to get spewed. Who is that helping, right? So I'd say through the sin of omission, not talking about issues, and then also just the dehumanization of people through focusing on them exclusively through a lens of pain. If you think of like Native peoples, most of the time it is through pipeline activism, histories of genocide. Like, when's the last time you've seen Native people presented on television, a mainstream television network, where somebody's talking about, well, I got a problem with my girlfriend, or my boyfriend did that, I don't like that. Just, you know, somebody going to work every day, somebody wearing jeans. So media tends to caricature us. We got to be very guarded about that. And that's why, to go back to a point I made a little while ago, it's all about who controls narratives.
So good, thank you. Who controls the narratives and who frames, right? Even going back to Frank Sesso's question, right? Who frames those stories? Matt or Lexi, where do you get, especially Matt as a storyteller, I'd love to also hear like what you're seeing.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to start out and then hand it over to Lexi, because I'm sure you have thoughts on this too, Lexi, is there's so many different things to point to, and we've talked about who are the storytellers, who's controlling the media. And when I say who are the storytellers, I don't mean the journalists who you let hold the mic, but like who are the people who are purchasing the mics, who is responsible up the chain. And you know, really in response to Lisa's question, I would just say to really consider who are those people and do they represent the communities that should be represented? But one point, a simple point that I'll make that's actually like really unfortunate and something that I grapple with a lot in my work is that, you know, over my career, over the last 8 years of my full-time career, I've done all this really powerful work I'm proud of. And, you know, outside of my full-time work with organizations that have names, like outside of my work with NASA or some of these others, in doing the work that I've done with Let's Care, I mean, I've been telling the same stories. I'm not better in my full-time work with NASA or with Project Drawdown, with the New York Times best-selling book, than I am outside of that. And yet it is so striking just from my own personal experience how, you know, with Let's Care, and I mentioned like the 20s and Change San Francisco film, I'm thankful that like some of the venues that can relate to these questions of identity that I cover, like the San Francisco Black Film Festival, Las Vegas Queer Arts Festival, have recognized the film that I made and said, this is meaningful. And yet at the same time, there are so many people that if you don't have that organization with the name tied to it, and if you don't have that flashy thing tied to it, well, then they don't want to really give you the time of day. And so, you know, that's one reason I am so thankful for my work at Project Drawdown, is because, you know, there is that name, the New York Times best-selling book, as I mentioned. So people will listen, but I just think people need to listen even if they don't think the person on the other end is important, whatever that looks like, because we're missing out on so many opportunities to tell important stories when we discount people because we say, well, that's not, you know, whoever, insert name here. We need to be more mindful of welcoming and in different perspectives than the ones that we're already welcoming in to partner with and collaborate with. And I think that's one place where the media is falling short, is in collaborating with the same types of people, or the same people literally again and again and again, and platforming those people again and again and again. But I know you, Lexi, you had some thoughts on this too, right?
Yeah, I was just gonna add to, as far as like specific examples of like environmental justice that the media just keeps getting wrong. And also I will say, I feel is very intentionally getting wrong, is something that I feel like throughout my college career kind of been looking at, which is pollution, but I'll say very specifically, like when it comes to oil spills, right? So like no DAPL is kind of what propelled me into environmental justice. I've been thinking about oil spills for a long time. And recently in my community, right off the coast of Orange County, we had a really big oil spill from a drill, and it just really so much oil into the water. And like most of the OC beaches, you just can't even go in the water right now. And I've seen it play out with other oil spills where it's talked about, oh, this one accident happened, and yes, it spilled so much oil. Yes, it spilled so much, whatever it might be. But like, it's fine. It's one time. It just happens. Or it's like, oh, it was an accident. Oh, it was because of this one person, this one thing. But like, don't worry, next time we'll get it right. And that is a lot of the narrative all the time. And it's the narrative that I'm seeing come up right now in Orange County. And it's just so deeply wrong, because not only is it not sort of acknowledging the experience that people are having right now, people who have like these cultural and traditional ties to the ocean, to these coastal communities, who depend on, you know, the coastal ecosystem for a living, but also just the fact that it sort of brushes this problem under the rug as like a one-time thing, and doesn't relate it back to the fact that it's happening because we have a dependency on fossil fuels. And this is going to keep happening because we're not addressing climate change, right? So there's also just like no link of these two issues of talking about oil spills, talking about pollution, to sort of the broader systems that are at play that are keeping these things happening, that are keeping us experiencing these things, and specifically that are keeping communities who have historically been oppressed to, you know, keep experiencing and having these injustices occur, right? Because not everyone has oil spills off their coast, but, you know, communities that have been historically oppressed do, right? Not all of us have water contamination, but communities who have historically been oppressed do. And when you look at that and you can see sort of the systems that underlie it, it becomes really clear. But when we frame it as like a one-time issue or something that just really randomly happened, and not as systemic issues of racism or, you know, even colonialism or whatever it might be, we just completely miss out on the nuance of it, and we'll never really address initially, first of all, the problem and the experiences that people are having because of it, but also address it from happening in the future. So I think that's something that I personally am experiencing right now in Orange County, but it's just really common throughout environmental justice communication in general.
Oh, that's so important, because again, we keep sort of bringing up and going back to the same points and circling back in terms of, you know, who frames discussion. I heard a lot about, I'm sure many of us did, the spill in Orange County, and yeah, the devastation that occurred there. We do have one other question from Two White Arrows. I wanted to know your thoughts on Flint, Michigan, Benton Harbor, Michigan, and the lead water crisis in these communities. And environmental justice. We kind of talked about that a little bit, but I do obviously want to, you know, get to, or at least mention that question. But did anyone have any other thoughts in particular about the situation in Flint, Benton Harbor, et cetera? Wanted to kind of jump in and share their thoughts there.
I would just jump in really quickly and say, well, you know, this makes me think about priority, like the fact that this injustice, that the Flint water crisis could be a thing that's not something that happened, but it's something that's ongoing, that the community still deals with. That's just unacceptable. And it reminds me of some different conversations I've had around how we need to prioritize representation and inputs from different communities. Because to me, that points to the fact that it's not prioritized at all. If that was a, primarily white community, or if that was a place like here in DC, and like name a neighborhood, Foggy Bottom, I don't think that the Foggy Bottom water crisis is happening anytime soon, is kind of what I'm saying, because if it does, then that's going to be addressed. And so, that I would really challenge folks to think about, why is this not more of a priority, not only for those in leadership positions, but for all of us? Why does this continue to not be top of mind for us, when if it was my faucet or my sink that's not working, or yours, obviously, then it's priority. But why does this continue to persist is sort of where I kind of think priority, because these things are not prioritized by communities that do not value those who are experiencing them, and communities that don't, for whatever reason, relate to those who are on the negative side and negatively impacted by the crisis in this case.
So important, so important. Thank you, Matt. Dr. Lemir or Lexi?
Yeah, I was going to add too that what's happening in Flint and, just stories like that, none of them are happening in isolation. These are just the stories that we know well. These are just the stories that have got to the national level that we all keep hearing about and that have got media recognition. But this is like the lived experience of so many people. And with that being said, I will say two different things. One is that that's the power of community coalition, right? When you come together as a community and you keep demanding and you're able to put pressure on the media, you're able to get your story out there. And obviously it does take a really long time when you're not a community who's being prioritized, as Matt said, to get these problems addressed, but people know about them. We're working towards solutions. Obviously, you have to keep, badgering the media to have your story be heard. But there are so many communities who are experiencing really similar things and just aren't getting the media coverage. And again, it's because they're not high priority communities. It's because they are communities who have been historically oppressed. And it's like, oh, that's just how it is there. Like, that shouldn't be how it is anywhere, right? Nobody should be experiencing that sort of environmental injustice or those sorts of pollutions, but we just decide that it's okay in some communities because it's just always been like that. So I will say too, like, even in the city, literally right next to me, they have really high levels of lead in their soil, and it's been known for a very long time, and there's just been no action around it. And it's because it is a predominantly Hispanic and predominantly immigrant community. And again, no national recognition, because there aren't a whole bunch of community coalitions sort of working to get media recognition of it, but it is the lived reality for a lot of people. So I just wanted to also say that that's something we should have in mind when we're thinking about issues like this, that none of these issues are happening in isolation, but it's all happening because of systems like racism, right, that are just deeply embedded into how we are experiencing the world around us.
Let me just throw in two things very briefly. At some point, we have to pivot back. Well, wait a minute. There were some people responsible for the poisoning of tens of thousands of people. So at some point, we got to start demanding accountability, penalties. And I'm not talking about, hey, you paid a $70,000 fine, this goes away. So we need to have an accountability framework. And then to Lexi's point, well, how many of these stories aren't being told? When we look at how many people, not just from water, but particularly lead in soil, but also lead dust coming from household paint, old windows, an abominable, disgraceful amount of young children are being poisoned. The most scariest 10 minutes of a parent's life, the scariest 10 minutes of a parent's life, when your kid gets a lead prick or a blood test, and then they go run the test to see if your kid has been poisoned, because that's not something that you give a magic pill to and the consequence goes away. Lead poisoning requires lifelong remediation, right? And it has impacts and spillover effects on so many effects and so many future points of an individual's livelihood. So that's what I'll throw in on that. It's a lot of Flint, maybe not due to water, but due to other sources.
Yeah, that is fantastic. I appreciate, yeah, so important. I just have one final question for our panelists to wrap us up. Thank you so much for our attendees who have stuck around and hung out, and the great questions from our audience. Really appreciate you. But what are one or two ways our audience, as a takeaway right, as a takeaway right now. One or two ways that they can be what I like to call champions of change in their everyday lives. So as we close out here, I'll let you start, Professor. What are one ways?
Yes, so I can't fully answer that. I don't like to tell others what to do, but I would say take a keen look at deploying your skill sets, no matter what they are. Deploy your skill sets for some useful purpose, and always keep in mind, have an orientation that centers those, or at least give an acute lens to those who are outside of power structures. And I'll pass the mic.
All right, I'll jump in first, I guess, and just say I think you know, the big thing I would say.
Just as far as
Lexi, I think there's a little bit of a lag, but I'll go first. Maybe your connection will come back. I was just saying really quickly that you know, I think a big thing that a lot of people don't realize that the power, the influence, the privilege that they have. And so I would say to stop and take inventory of the ways that you have influence, that you have power, and kind of take stock of that, because then you're able to think about how are you using that power. I'll leave it at that, because I think that that's a big gap. You know, a lot of people feel like they don't have the influence, the level of influence that they actually have. And so when you do take stock of that, then you kind of realize how you could shift it toward communities that could benefit from you actually using the power that you do actually have, to actually build a more just world when it comes to climate and otherwise. Lexi, bringing us home.
Okay, I think my signal's like getting a little bit choppy on my end. It like senses we're coming to the end. It's like, okay, no more Wi-Fi. But yeah, I was just gonna add on and say, I guess to both of those points, definitely being aware of like your positionality and your skill set is super helpful in finding what is your lane within the environmental movement, right? Like there are so many different needs within this space and working towards climate justice. No person can do everything, but you definitely, just from your own personal experiences, already have expertise in something. So figure out how to contribute that expertise to, you know, the ultimate goal of climate justice. But within that, again, you don't have to do it all. You don't have to build from the ground up. There are people already working towards the same goals you are. Figure out who they are and how to plug into them. You don't have to feel like you have to reinvent the wheel. Just plug into groups that already are needing your skill sets or where you can contribute, so that you can really just help build coalition and work towards that ultimate goal while also gaining new skills, right? Until you're able to do other roles and other jobs within that. But yeah, I would just say figuring out really what it is that's your lane that you already have the skills for.
That is a perfect way for us to end, and it is exactly 3 o'clock. So thank you, everyone. Thank you to our amazing panelists. You're all just absolutely fantastic. It was such an honor to be able to sit, share space, thoughts and ideas with you all this afternoon. So thank you so much, Professor. Hope the baby feels better. Lexi and Matt, continue. Let's keep it up. Let's keep moving. My colleagues at Planet Forward, thank you again for always including me in meaningful and important events and conversations. So well, with that, everyone, have a good one, be blessed, be great, and do something nice for yourselves today. All right, thank you.